And he would say, "Don't run, it startles the horses." It turns out that's an old British cavalry axiom. If you're responding to a crisis, you need to be methodical about it as you get ready to ride to the scene. And if you're running all over the place, it's going to be harder to get the horses saddled and get them, line and get them going.
The fact that it's always crisis means that you don't have a strategy.
If all you do is crisis, you're going to be really good at responding to fires. You're going to spend all your time training to respond to fires. And you're going to have to respond to a lot of fires because no one's focused on fire prevention.
Welcome to Science of Leadership, where we explore leadership both practically and scientifically. What makes great leadership, why these things matter, and how we can do them well. Those are the questions we wrestle with through thoughtful discussions and real-world stories. I'm Tom Collins, and today we are joined by one of our prior guests, retired U.S. Navy Admiral Scott Swift. Admiral Swift commanded the U.S. Pacific Fleet, one of the largest and most complex operational commands in the world, and his leadership insights are unparalleled. Today, we're talking about a powerful principle he shared with me when I interviewed him for my study of four-star officers. If everything is a crisis, then nothing is a crisis. Admiral Swift, thanks for coming back to Science of Leadership to discuss this topic, and thank you for your service to our nation.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I always appreciate being invited back a second time. It says something about the first time was a value to folks, and it's great to see the podcast and your book, what it's done since the last time we spoke. Well done on your part, and I hope those listening in get value from this session as well.
Well, thanks. Well, for those who are listening, here's the big idea for today's episode. Leaders who treat every issue as an emergency create chaos, burnout, and confusion. Leaders who distinguish between urgent and important, between real crises and routine turbulence, build resilient, high-functioning teams. Thoughts on that, sir?
Yeah, I think that's really important with any organization. Oftentimes we're consumed by the crisis and we lose the opportunity to shape the organization to move beyond just crisis response. And certainly my time in the military, I would say the first 15 years, it was really about crisis response, not because of anything that was going on in the world, but because of the things that the organizations that I was a part of was doing, and I was junior. I wasn't working on the futures part, the things, the plans for the next year or the plans for the next 2 years. It was really executing the planning that had been completed previous to the day that you're in or the week that you're in or the month that you're in. And you get trapped in this cycle in organizations as you mature within the organization. You find yourself most comfortable managing crisis. And that's what you're drawn to. And that doesn't sustain an organization. The organization, there's a part of it that needs to focus in the near term. There's another part that needs to focus in the long term. And my experience is leadership investment, it has to, the weight of it needs to be in the long term, or you find yourself trapped in just managing the day-to-day crisis operations as opposed to managing the trajectory of the organization as it moves into the future.
It's this sense of being a firefighter. I think there are a lot of people out there. I've worked with a number of people who see themselves as firefighters, and that sounds sexy. That sounds like that's a great thing. But if your organization is one that's characterized by constant firefighting, it's probably because you've done a bad job of building the organization and the people that can handle important decisions and all those sorts of things. So, yeah, I think you're right. We can't get stuck in that mentality. We can't get stuck in this. This is how it is. We're just going to be in crisis mode all the time, and that's really a negative thing.
Yeah, if I could tag on that, Tom, that resonates with me. My son's a firefighter, and being in the military, firefighting was a large part of what we did as part of our training. But it's interesting as he has matured in his organization. Eventually you become a battalion chief or the chief of the department. They're not responding to every fire or every incident. EMTs are responding to every incident. If it's a little bit larger, then obviously then often a fire truck will go with them to the scene. But you have this hierarchical approach to managing the response. That may be a trigger, could be a crisis. But if the whole organization approaches it as a crisis, as opposed to an organizational challenge, then everyone is a fireman just there to fight the fire, and you don't have that battalion chief or the senior firefighter on scene to manage it and know when to call for backup, or that the fire boundary has been exceeded and more people are required. I think the firefighting analogy is really apt.
Well, let's start by sort of defining our terms, if you will, for our conversation. When you think about this idea of when everything is a crisis, nothing is a crisis, what does that principle really mean?
Well, I touched on it. We've touched on it already in the opening comments that you within an organization, as you grow up in the organization, you get very good at crisis management, and that becomes the skill sets that you believe is what's most important to the organization and whatever its function is. And you don't get into the operational level of the organization. What is it that makes the organization function more broadly? Here again, I think the firefighting analogy applies. It certainly applies in military organizations. It applies in commercial organizations. I mean, if you look at the airlines, if you have an airplane that is delayed and everybody is focused on that single airplane delay, there needs to be what I call the operational level of an organization that is asking the question why. There's three questions to ask to limit the tendency to get pulled down to the crisis level. The first question is why? Why are we having this problem? Is it a mechanical failure of the airplane? Is it something that's unique to the airport? Is it a weather failure that's impacting multiple airports? Is it a software glitch in our scheduling program? That's at a very high level within an organization to ask all those whys, and you're trying to anticipate what the ultimate solution is. It may not just be that one gate that has a problem with a mechanical on the air bridge, for instance. And then at that middle level, the operational level, it's people that are not consumed by the crisis that can look broadly across the organization to say, what can we do to support those first responders, if you will, to the immediate issue of that single airplane to ensure that we don't have a problem with the entire airport or the entire region. That's the value of thinking beyond just a crisis. The other point that I'll make is my experience is that people, regardless if they've grown up with an organization, just the maturity process as you become more experienced in life, we tend to go back to our comfort zone. And initially, my experiences with people is they spend their formative years dealing with crisis. That's where they're most comfortable. So that's what they gravitate towards. A police response. There are some policemen in an active shooter incident that respond, rightfully so, immediately to the scene, and we've seen the success of that protocol, if you will. But there are a number of initial responders that take a broader look to say, is this an isolated incident or is this first in a series or several that are happening? You don't want to get trapped by just that crisis response. Even in an active shooter situation, you need to take a broader view. I would say the strategic view broadly across the city, if it's a city police department, the operational view of the area that that's occurring in. Is this first in a series or are there other? And then, of course, the initial response. The initial response, the crisis response, is often what is the most consequential in what people see. And oftentimes that's why people think that if you're really good at that, the organization will be good, will be really good as well. It's not necessarily true. All that means is the organization is really good to crisis response. Don't you want people to anticipate what that crisis might be and spend your time preventing it? Back to my son's experience as a firefighter. He spends a very small part of his time responding to fires and car accidents and those kinds of things. He spends most of his time working on how do we prevent fires. That's what the city wants. They have to have a first level fire department, but they want to, and that fire department invested in preventing fires more than just responding to fires. I mean, insurance rates go through the roof. It's hard to manage. It just goes on and on. So I think it's core to the subject of this podcast of how you can get trapped in just focusing on an excellence in crisis response.
Yeah, there were so many great wisdoms in that, in what you were discussing just then. And near the end there, I started, basically you were talking about preventative medicine, really, in a sense, in my mind, right? And our our nation is not the best historically, presently perhaps, at thinking about preventative medicine. We're really good at crisis. Our whole medical system is predicated on insurers not wanting to pay for preventive care. They want to pay for the fact that you had a heart attack or that all these sorts of things, and and all that we're seeing with vaccines and all that. I mean, it's this mentality of we're only going to fix it if it's broken. It's a fascinating thing. And so anyway, I think that diffuses, obviously, as I'm saying, diffuses across so many domains in in our society and operations and all these sorts of things.
Yeah, here's the challenge with that. I think that's exactly right, Tom. The challenge is how do you justify the resources that you're expending to create to prevent a crisis? With those that are managing budgets, we're spending all this money and there's no data that says that we're getting return on investment. But there is some science involved. If you go to rent a car and you're younger than 25, you may not be able to rent it. And if you do rent it, the rates are going to be higher because the science is the part of your brain that assesses risk is not fully developed until you're 25. It's strictly a math science approach by the insurance industry trying to protect their resources. When you're younger, I spent way more time in the emergency room when I was 25 and younger. Now I spend way more time in preventive medicine, now that I'm over
Mhm.
60, because that's the realm. My body isn't what it was back when I was 25. I'm not doing those stupid things, but also it's aging. So I'm spending more time. So I'm very interested in preventive medicine now. When I was younger, I wanted to go to a critical care unit that was really well known. But from a business perspective, once again, you've got to take that broader look of what is it that you want to do. The emergency room is not generating a lot of revenue for a hospital, and it's not generating a lot of value for the community. It's the overall health of the community. It's all the rest of that occurs in a hospital system that really provides the greatest value for the community, and that's lost sometimes if you're stuck in this cycle of focusing on crisis.
Yeah, and thinking about, if everything's a crisis, nothing is a crisis. There are certain people that I feel like, and we probably could do a study on I'm sure we could do a study on this, but there's certain people who it seems that that's whether by their natural inclination or because they get some kind of high off of it or whatever it may be, they seem to perpetuate that, right? They're the boy who cries wolf almost, it seems like to me, and when people are that type of person, eventually it attenuates, that is, it decreases our response to it so that when an actual crisis does come up, nobody's prepared for it.
Most of the people that I interact with are very highly, functional isn't the right term, but they're very proactive. They've always, we were talking before we came on air about what we had been doing over the holidays, and both of us have stayed, very, very busy in that time period. I think it's just the nature of our personalities. I suspect it's the nature of the personalities that listen to your podcast, and that the analogy that I use is you talk to somebody that is crisis focused and it's, I'm really busy doing something important. I mean, look how important it is. Look at this crisis that I'm dealing with. I have to continue to do this important work. Well, as you mature within the organization, the value of the organization is, yes, its ability to respond to crisis, but how do we prevent crisis? Because crises are very disruptive to the organization. So it's that challenge of looking beyond that. I mentioned the first question that organizations should ask is why. Maybe not the crisis responders should be asking why. Although keep going back to my son, when they're responding to a fire call, they're asking themselves in the fire truck as they're driving to the scene, what failed? Why are we responding? What could we have done to prevent this? Either traffic design or traffic signals or fire prevention, whatever it may be done. So the first question is why. And then the how. What are all the different hows that we could apply to correct this? In the medical field, it may be prenatal care, if that's where the challenges are. It's more education for families and in the process of caring for an unborn and eventually a newborn, and then it continues on up the chain. And there's multiple hows that you can solve the problem. We could go into more detail on that, but probably beyond the scope of this podcast. And then the last thing is, okay, given all those hows, we could do it with education. We could do it with more funding. We could do it with investment in more modern equipment. We could do it by increasing the size of the hospital. We could team with other hospitals. These are all hows. And then eventually, of all those hows, you pick the what that you're going to do. We're going to invest some money in this equipment. We're going to team with this other hospital that is very highly performing in this area. But in crisis, you go right to the what. You have to. What do we have to do to save people? What do we have to do to save property? And you're not focused on those hows. How could we solve this problem more broadly than just in the ecosystem that we're focused on as a company? And then the most important question is the why. And once you've responded to a crisis, rarely do we go back and do the forensics of saying, how else could we have taken care of this problem? And why did the problem initially occur?
Let me pause here for a second and remind our listeners that my book, The 4 Stars of Leadership, is now available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and essentially all online outlets. It's getting rave reviews, and I'm certain you will find it not only informative, but also inspiring. So I hope you'll order your copy today. Now let's get back to this interesting conversation. Those are great steps in thinking through addressing crises and so forth. As I've thought about this topic in leading up to our conversation, I've been thinking a lot about, and I think as I'm listening to you, I'm coming away with, there are kind of two ways that we could approach this conversation, and I think I'm tracking on one track and you're sort of on the other. So I'm trying to figure out how I can bring my thoughts over to where you are. But is that when I think of, if everything's a crisis, nothing is a crisis, I'm thinking of trying to tell folks, hey, look, don't blow things out of proportion. right? And as I'm listening, what I'm learning in this moment from you is that there are crises. How do you mitigate those? How do you prevent them from becoming a crisis? Am I on track with that?
There's several individuals and organizations that have explored this academically, and it's the quad chart. It's that if you are just an organization that is crisis focused, and the things that we've been talking about, you're almost doomed to always respond to crisis. As my mind goes more towards military examples, but
Sure.
I look at Eisenhower. This is a data point. It's interesting that the only decision that Eisenhower held for himself on D-Day was the weather decision. He said if he delegated all the authorities, he was intimately involved in the planning. He was confident that everything, all the whys, the hows, and the whats had been taken care of, that people knew how to handle problems if they occurred. The one problem that he was not confident was a deviation in weather. But he held that position to himself. If the sea state was too high, the ships couldn't get underway, they couldn't make the transfer of the soldiers from the bigger ships to the smaller landing craft to go ashore, and there was no way to control that. So he held that to himself because he knew that if a decision to cancel was made prematurely, the whole operation would have been put at unnecessary risk. It would have required crisis planning to reset it. And of course, we know from history, the weather was not good. He made the decision to delay a day. He made it early enough. The forces had been set in the harbors, but they hadn't got underway. So there was risk that the Germans would see where the mass of forces was now exposed to reconnaissance craft. There was a risk associated with that, but he owned that strategic risk, that operational risk at his level, by ensuring at the tactical level he didn't create an unnecessary crisis. And he's got I think you're familiar with it. He's got a chart that explains graphically how not to get trapped in that corner of crisis response individually and as an organization.
Yeah, and that's a great. I've used that in so many permutations of conversations, the urgent, the important, and so forth, to help people that I coach, mentor, and so on. Um, and I think I made it into a video, but I don't think it's for the podcast. I may have included it in one podcast very early in the show, but anyway, yeah, that's highly valuable, just to get you to stop and think, okay, actually, how is this affecting me? Where is my role in this? That's critical for determining what is really urgent and important, i.e., kind of crisis, versus most everything else is not.
The organization will try it at a scene. I had 140,000 people that worked for me when I was the Pac Fleet commander, and they were doing incredible things every day. There is a tendency for the organization to draw you into the crisis that they're dealing with at whatever level it is. It's a self-confidence issue. Some of it, those crises are new to them, and that matrix helps prevent. And it's not useful for senior leaders to get drawn into that. Where I see this in the
Mhm.
media, that those leaders that I have admired most when the organization has dealt with crisis, those leaders have always risen above the crisis, and almost invariably they go to the why. So if a CEO's organization is, there's a shooting in one of its stores, or there's a leadership crisis. I mean, you name the crisis, almost invariably that senior leader is talking about the why. We are responding to the initial crisis. These are the things we're doing. But what I'm focused on already is, why did this happen? FEMA is part of that. When they're responding to crisis, the FEMA director, the conversation that they are having is at a much higher level. They're talking about the depth of resources that they have. They're not involved down at the ground level. And a lot of times you see this in engaging with the media. They'll ask a ground level question, and senior leaders are very, very uncomfortable saying, I don't know, but I'll find out. They feel like they have to know all that level of detail, when it's absolutely impossible when you're talking about an organization that, 140,000 strong, and they're deployed across half the world. That's just an example of how that matrix helps everybody at the tactical level, the operational, the senior level, understand what should your focus be in crisis. It's not down dealing with the crisis itself necessarily. It's dealing with the implications of that crisis in the context of the larger organization.
This idea that as leaders, we need to take a step back and think about the why, and not respond necessarily to the media. We'll call it media, quote unquote, but that question, or that thing that tries to drag us into the crisis. Our job is to be thinking on a higher level to address not only the issue, but the bigger issue that underlies it, I think.
Sure. Sure. Let me give you another example, Tom, and that using a board example. So you've got a company that is a retail company, and you've got just rolled out a big media piece on this new product that you were going to and have a supply chain issue, and that product hasn't gotten. It's supposed to be in stores on Monday, and it probably won't be there for another 2 weeks because of a supply chain issue. As you get pressure from the board to say, we've got to get out in front of this. We need to explain to the public. We've set expectations with this media program, and now it's not going to be there. Well, there are levels in the organization. There's some people that are working the specific store by store of how do they get that product to the store. There's others that are working the supply chain issue. That's what you have if you pursue this matrix approach of how are we going to commit ourselves as an organization to a crisis. And then you've got the CEO. It doesn't have to be media. It may be board members that are concerned about share prices and other things, rightfully so. They have a fiduciary responsibility. But the CEO may be saying, I think appropriate thing in this analogy that I brought up is for a CEO to say, we will get to that. We are set up to handle this problem. We know the why behind this is a supply chain issue. We don't know exactly what the supply chain issue is, but we've trained our people not to gravitate to just the crisis. We're taking a holistic look at this problem, and it's going to take some time to get the answers. That's the why part of it, of why I can't give you a response right now. It's going to take time to develop the crisis thing. I can tell you exactly store by store what's not there. I can't tell you exactly how we're going to fix that because we don't understand the perturbation in the supply system. And the why part of it, why this happened, did we go with the wrong supply chain people? Was there an issue in shipping? Is it a computer glitch? We'll get to the why with time. It's going to take time to discover. The one thing that I was in a senior job, and my job was daily operations, and it was dealing with crisis. I was the J3 at Indo-PACOM, and I had a Marine colonel pull me aside after about 2 or 3 months in the job, and he made a comment to me. He said, with absolute respect, we've been together long enough, but I feel you understand where this is coming from. And he said, sir, I will just say something to keep in mind is here at this level that we're operating in, fast is slow. I was used to running it when I was a lieutenant. I was going, it's what we talked about earlier in the podcast. The people are in crisis. All right, I can't talk now. I've got to get going. His point was I was pushing too fast. I was looking for answers that we needed time to figure out exactly what the right answer was moving forward. I think that fast is slow analogy applies in this. How do you manage crisis across the breadth of an organization?
As you were talking there, I think there are a number of things that you hit on, but the thing that really caught my attention was you were discussing about a CEO, right, who is talking about is feeling this pressure from the board, and I think that you hit on something I've been thinking a lot about with regard to this idea that in that moment the CEO has to preserve the signal to noise ratio. In that, if you're always broadcasting everything's a crisis, if you get sucked into that moment that we've been talking about, instead of staying where you need to be as a leader, you get sucked into that, you get revved up like everybody else, and you get frenetic and you're trying to act. You disseminate that message across the entirety of whatever your span of influence is, and that revs everybody up. And so then it creates this, they don't know what's signal and what's noise. They take everything as signal, but it may not be affecting them at all. This crisis, quote unquote, may not be in their domain at all, but now because you're the leader, you've revved them up, and so everything's a crisis. And so then it creates this state where everybody is in chronic stimulation mode. And when that happens, just from a neurocognitive standpoint, our brains downregulate those stimuli so that moving forward, we don't respond, even though it might actually be a crisis in our domain. We've gotten so used to all this input, we ignore it while our house is burning down.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I think that goes back to the striation may not be the right term, but the structure, the vertical structure of an organization, and how we're going back to Eisenhower and the Matrix. How do you insulate, not isolate, but insulate yourself from getting trapped in that crisis corner? The first thing I wrote down when you were chatting about is it's not the product, it's the people. And I think that applies whether you're in the military and you're responsible for conducting an operation. I would characterize the operation as the product. It's the people that are going to deliver operational success or tactical success. I think it's the same in business. If the product analogy I use as a business context is that you've got a product that you said it would be available in stores on Monday. If that product wasn't available, if you're just focused on the product and the process, it's going to take you longer to make it right, and also to describe it to the customers that you may be losing because they feel unfulfilled by an expectation that you had set for them. It's the people that are going to fix it. And so when I go back to the FEMA analogy, it's really on the volunteers and others that are responding that and those that leadership is focused on when they're saying we're really lucky to have the people that we have. I'm listening to them to find out what their needs are because my responsibility is for them and their needs. Their responsibility is for the needs for those that have been impacted directly by this crisis. So that if from a leadership perspective, at the further up you go, if you treat everything as a crisis, you're going to get brain lock and you're going to get muscle lock. The organization is not going to be as agile as it needs to be to respond. I had I was a deputy commander of Naval Forces Central Command back in 2006, 2007 timeframe, and I had a British counterpart. He was a fellow deputy with me, and he made a comment that really jumped out at me then, and it comes to mind. You just brought it to mind again, Tom. And he would say, "Don't run; it startles the horses." It turns out that's an old British cavalry axiom about, to junior officers and from senior officers and applied to senior officers as well, is that if you're responding to a crisis, you need to be methodical about it as you get ready to ride to the scene. And if you're running all over the place, it's going to be harder to get the horses saddled and get them, line and get them going. It's that same thing where, my comment was at those levels, fast is slow. You just you have to be focused on those things that you should be focused on at a higher level. It is at the crisis, but it's focused on the crisis, but you're not a first responder, or your first response isn't to figure out which rooms are on fire. It's to figure out, do they have a water supply? Are there individuals involved? Have the hospitals been notified? It's a broader context.
Yeah, and I think also preserving the sense of crisis, right? That act like it's a crisis when it's a real crisis.
Yeah, that's a large part of it is that if everything is a crisis, that's all you're going to focus on. You lose the ability to control your future. My comment initially when we first started talking was there's that, what I would say, that middle layer, that organizational layer that's focused on the near term, and that higher level that's focused on the further out, the futures, the strategic part of where is the organization going. If you're just focused on crisis, what you hear comments that when the company is put at risk, never saw that coming. I never saw this shift in our customer base of where their interest would be or where their needs would be. Well, if you were moving beyond crisis, you might have seen that. You need to
Right.
do those market surveys. You need to understand what best practices are.
I would say that if your organization is typified by being in constant crisis and you're always in crisis management mode, there is no strategy in your organization because you don't have time to actually to conceptualize and to actuate any kind of strategy. If all you're doing that the fact that it's always crisis means that you don't have a strategy.
If all you do is crisis, you're going to be really good at responding to fires. You're going to spend all your time training to respond to fires. And you're going to have to respond to a lot of fires because no one's focused on fire prevention.
And thinking about this idea of maintaining that signal to noise and ratio and not acting like everything is a crisis, something that we see in medicine. People have studied this phenomenon in ICUs in particular, especially in like neonatal ICUs. You have 100 of these tiny babies, right? They may weigh a pound, may weigh up to, I don't know, 3 pounds, something like that. Okay, so we're talking about tiny little people. And they've got all these alarms attached to them to make sure that they're breathing, make sure their heart's beating, et cetera, right? And what happens is the fidelity of those instruments can be offset and so that those instruments may alarm because they have thresholds that you set. If the heart rate is below this, alarm. If the heart rate is above that, alarm. And so when you get 100 of these little babies with 5 or 6 different instruments attached to them, all of which can alarm over various things, and with a significant amount of infidelity, then alarms are not infrequent. And what happens is that people become basically acclimated or attenuated to the alarms, and they won't respond to them because they've seen enough times, quote unquote, where it's just a false alarm against sort of this boy that cried wolf. And so that has happened in real events. People actually work. There are people whose job it is to improve sensor technology, to decrease what's called alarm fatigue. People's minds just get fatigued by all this alarm, this constant crisis, so that they don't respond. Because in those situations where they do have alarm fatigue, when a real crisis or a real event happens, it can be missed. And when you're talking about a 1 pound baby, that is absolutely life and death.
I've seen that happen many times, both in my career and since I've retired as well. Yeah, it reminds me of in a training. I mean, this is I'll scale this up. So the the time that comes to my mind as I was listening to you is I was on a training mission. Had an instructor in the back seat, and we were transiting from the base that we are our home base, and I was learning how to fly the airplane, the specific airplane that I was going to fly in the fleet. And we were transiting to a training range. We were stationed in Central California. The training range was up in Nevada, so it's just a transit. I had my wings, had done this 100 times before, but there was a huge thunderstorm that was over the Sierras, and it's all I focused on. I mean, my mind, as an aviator, rarely do you look to the windscreen. You've got 1,000 things going on that you're monitoring in your head. Most of it is, the visual from the instruments, but also I got gravitated on that thunderstorm. And there was a turn point that was before the thunderstorm. I hadn't even done the calculation to see where is that turn point. This may not be a problem at all if that turn point is before the thunderstorm. And it was. It was, if we're going to take a 45-degree turn and the thunderstorm wasn't going to be a factor. But that's all I focused on. And I went past the turn point, and the instructor in the back seat said, "Hey, are we going to turn?" And that all of a sudden, reality came. Um, I don't like using sports analogies, but I'll use it. I'll use it in this case, and I'll use football as the example of a series of escalating crises. The four downs, and because there's a leader, a specific leader there, it's the quarterback. It's more analogous to this conversation. So the quarterback, if he doesn't make the first down on the first play, then the crisis starts to escalate. So on the second down, if he still hasn't made the first down, instead of 10 yards, he may be 15 yards because they got a loss. Now he's really got a crisis on his hand. And eventually that you get to the fourth down, and now the coach has to make the call. Do we kick it, or do we try to make it? So that coach in his mind is thinking in the context, okay, if we get close, am I going to take the risk in the entire game of maybe turning it over at this point in the field? Which may be too high risk. If they're almost to the goal line, then he may decide what's the sense in kicking it, probably kick a field goal. But for the sake of argument, you understand about the crisis escalation. So the question is, am I a manager or a coach in that scenario? So when I commanded the fleet, if there was a crisis that was going on, that oftentimes when I was junior and observing commanders, they transitioned from manager and coach to leader quarterback, and they would go into the operations center and start directing things. My model was I didn't go to the operations center, because just going there sends a message to the team is that you don't trust them, that you think that they may need your help or your assistance. I wanted them to have the confidence. Back to the Eisenhower analogy, they were trained, they knew how to handle these things. If things started to escalate, that I had a sense that it was beyond their scope, their training, the resources, the authorities they have, then I would go to the operations center, but it would be to observe. It would to be a manager. It would to be as a coach, encouraging them. You got this. We work through this. You're making good decisions. And then if things continue to scale up, then it was time to be a leader. Then it was time to be the quarterback and maybe even the coach, that you're making operational or strategic decisions based on this series of downs that might impact this quarter or the next quarter. So it's not just a binary piece. I think the challenge we're talking about here that you and I agree with is that we gravitate towards the crisis regardless of what level we're at. And that's not good for an organization. An organization needs to train the entire organization about how are we going to respond to a crisis. We need to separate senior leadership out from the tactical edge, back to the Eisenhower analogy.
Yeah, that's helpful to thinking about it. In that, I think that is a good use of a sports analogy, the four downs, and what does that mean? I think looking at studies, people have studied, this idea of constant crisis environments and so forth. And I think bringing that in here is a good spot to kind of hit on those. But if everything's in a constant crisis framing, it creates this state of, I mentioned it earlier, chronic stress, and which impairs our cognitive function. It increases burnout. McEwen and colleagues found that chronic stress elevates our cortisol and reduces our cognitive flexibility, impairing judgment, memory, and decision making quality, which when you are in a crisis is exactly the cognitive functions that you need. So you're blunting your ability to deal with a real crisis by thinking you're always in a crisis. Second finding, when we inflate everything to the level of a crisis, it erodes trust in our leadership. So Bly and colleagues found that when leaders exaggerate urgency, followers become skeptical and disengage. And studies show that when leaders exaggerate urgency, the followers just really don't pay attention to what the leaders are directing or trying to say anymore. Has tremendous consequences from that standpoint. Then conversely, when we talk about calm, even leadership, that improves performance under pressure. Research on high reliability organizations, such as a study that was done by Wyke and Sutcliffe, shows that teams perform best when leaders remain composed and differentiate between routine variation and true anomaly. So when leaders blur that line between inconvenience and crisis, four things happen in teams. One, they become reactive instead of proactive. Two, they lose creativity because they're always in survival mode. Three, they stop making decisions and wait for the leader. Four, they emotionally shut down to protect themselves. So that's some of the science that's out there on this topic.
Yeah, that third point, Tom, I think is critical, that they stop making decisions and wait for the leader. That's an organization that hews towards crisis. Because oftentimes they can handle things well before they recognize it at subordinate levels that we can take care of this, but I'm not sure how leadership is going to feel if we're this is normally things the commander does, so I'm not going to respond to it. And the leader, the commander, it morphs into a crisis, and then the commander focuses on it and becomes self-perpetuating, and consequently you end up with an organization that is constantly responding to crisis. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think those 4 points are all important, but that third point is a challenge from the perspective of it helps drive it to a perpetuating ecosystem, if you will, within an organization.
Well, now that we've kind of hit on, what it is, why it matters, some of the science behind it, you've given us some different strategies, but if you were to nail down practical directives, if you will, what do you recommend for folks to prevent making everything a crisis?
So don't know. I would reframe the question a little bit, Thomas. My recommendation for an organization, and that is to delegate authorities. You mentioned the second piece, which is the most important thing that we do as individuals is build trust. Trust is also the most perishable element of any relationship. If you're not building it, it's decaying. And the metric of trust is loyalty. That doesn't mean you can build trust with everybody. It doesn't mean that you can gain loyalty from everyone. But I'm always struck when I hear somebody in an organization telling another member of the organization you're not being loyal. It's because they don't, oftentimes it's because they don't trust. So that trust element is important. One way to get to trust is to delegate those authorities that you have. The organizations that I was a part of in the military and those organizations I'm a part of now, those increased authorities are oftentimes the driver for people's desire to promote up. They want those authorities. And then I come in and I tell them, well, a high performing organization, you want to delegate all those authorities down. Well, wait a minute. I fought hard to get these authorities. So if you're reluctant to delegate those authorities, there's two areas to focus on. One is the one thing to focus on is why don't you want to delegate those authorities? So there's lots of different reasons, but two key reasons. One is I don't trust the people. Then you go build trust. And the second is you don't feel they have the training. Then get them the training. But delegating those authorities is going to make the organization stronger. It's going to free you up to focus on things that you haven't focused on, those non-crisis things, to drive the organization to higher levels of performance. So that delegation of authority, I think, is key. And the second point I would make is don't delegate responsibility. I see more often the flip. People delegate responsibility for things, and they never delegate the authorities to do them. I tell junior people, don't accept responsibility unless they're going to give you the authority to execute those responsibilities, those tasks that you've been given. So that works against an organization. It ties all in with this crisis response. People that are most comfortable with crisis response are those that are most uncomfortable delegating the authorities and let subordinates respond to the crisis. Well, you stay at a higher level, that calmer level of focusing on the how did we get here, the why did we get here, and the hows about how we prevent this in the future.
Probably 60% of the 4 stars that I interviewed for my book said delegate authority, retain responsibility. And just like you said, I've told so many people, I try to remind myself of it too all the time. Never accept responsibility without authority, because that is a recipe for failure.
Individual failure and organizational failure. You're trapping yourself if you find yourself doing that, delegating responsibility without the authorities.
Yeah. When and thinking about this topic, I came up with 4 things I think that leaders can do to prevent from making everything a crisis. Number 1, categorize, don't catastrophize. So every issue gets sorted into buckets. One is crisis, which is an immediate threat that is both urgent and important. The second level is important, but not really urgent. And so that's a strategic issue that the leader can address that's not time sensitive. Then there's urgent, and this is all drawn from Eisenhower's framework, really, but not important. And that's a time sensitive issue that's stable and does not require the leader's direct intervention. And then noise, which is neither important nor urgent, and you should just not even, like, that should never reach your level of cognition. So that categorize, don't catastrophize. Number 2, communicate using precise, calibrated language. So we should be intentional. This is important, but not a crisis. This requires monitoring, not mobilization, things like that. Number 3, build decision-making capacity in the organization. This gets to your point about delegation and giving people the authority to make decisions without our intervention. If we're the only ones that can declare a crisis, then our organizations are brittle, and we need to empower others to act, because then they can manage that local turbulence and the system will become more resilient. And then the fourth and final one that I came up with was protect attention and emotion. This gets back to a lot of the research that I was talking about earlier, in that we have to preserve our team's mental readiness by keeping them from being in a constant chronic crisis mode. So anyway, those are some things I identified.
I want to touch on two things. I think all four of those are excellent, but I want to touch on communicate. I would just add that it's really, you communicate differently up than you do down, and you communicate differently horizontally. You're going to get, as wherever you are in the organization, you're going to be in a crisis, getting a lot of questions from above. It's the media piece that we talked about earlier. So you have to modulate all of that communication. And it may be telling people that are asking for information that it's too early to tell, is to say, we'll have to get back to you. We're not quite there yet. You also have to be careful about slowing the crisis response process down by constantly asking for more information that, down to the subordinate level. So that element of communication, I think, is important. And on the fourth thing, the protect attention and emotion, for me, it's the statement of passion is a good thing and emotion is not. In personal relationships, in public relationships, in organizational relationships, if you feel yourself getting emotional about something, you need to unwind it a little bit. Passion about what the organization is doing, passion about the response of the organization is important. But boy, once you cross that threshold to emotion, you're probably being counterproductive in your engagements.
Great advice. Well, Admiral Swift, before we punch out here, one question for you remaining. If you could go back to that aviation reserve officer candidate, cadet at San Diego State, and tell him one critical piece of leadership wisdom, what would it be?
The domain of what I don't know is much larger than the domain of what I know. And when I was a young cadet, I thought that I had complete knowledge of everything that was important in life. And I would go back to that young Scott Swift and say, you need to spend more time exploring the boundaries of your knowledge. That's not the limit. There's a lot beyond that. And be a little quieter about what you think you understand of the boundary that you're in. And I think it's the work that's in your book, Tom. It's the podcast. You're drawing people out to the edges of their knowledge and pushing beyond it a little bit. I've got this spiel on known unknowns. Yeah, that's another, 2-hour discussion probably. But
We can have you back for a third time.
You need to get you need to get out of your comfort zone. You think you know things. It's so easy to judge. Here's how I would sum it. It's so easy to judge because it's so hard to understand. Do the hard thing and seek the understanding of things that don't make sense to you.
Admiral Swift, great way to end out. As always, an honor and privilege to get to talk to you. Thanks for coming back on the Science of Leadership. Really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me back, Tom.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.